They called it the happiest plantation in North Carolina, and from the outside it looked like paradise. The Ashworth estate sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime tobacco land with whitewashed slave quarters that looked more like cottages than the typical ramshackle cabins, with gardens where vegetables grew in neat rows, with a big house that gleamed in the sunlight like something from a storybook. But the most remarkable thing about the Ashworth estate wasn't the clean quarters, or the adequate food, or the absence of whipping posts. The most remarkable thing was the slaves themselves. Always smiling, always cheerful, always appearing to be content with their bondage in ways that visitors found both heartwarming and deeply unsettling. Look at them, visitors would say, watching the slaves work in the fields, tend the gardens, serve meals in the big house. They're smiling, they're happy. This is proof that slavery, when practiced humanely, can be a benevolent institution. This is what all plantations should aspire to be. But if those visitors had looked more closely, if they'd studied those smiles with any real attention, they would have seen something wrong. They would have noticed that the smiles never reached the eyes, that they were fixed and unchanging, that they looked more like masks than genuine expressions of happiness. They would have noticed the way the slaves' hands trembled sometimes, the way their voices carried an edge of desperation, the way they flinched when Mistress Ashworth approached, even though she never raised her hand in violence. They would have noticed that the smiles weren't expressions of joy, they were expressions of terror. My name is Abel, and I arrived at the Ashworth estate in the spring of 1855, transferred from a brutal plantation in South Carolina, where I'd spent 28 years learning that survival meant endurance, that resistance meant death, that hope was a luxury slaves couldn't afford. I was 30 years old, scarred from countless whippings, hardened by years of brutality, expecting the Ashworth estate to be just another version of the hell I'd always known. But what I found was something far more disturbing than simple physical cruelty. What I found was a system of control so sophisticated, so psychologically devastating, that it made traditional plantation brutality look almost honest by comparison, because at least with whips and chains you knew what you were dealing with. You knew your enemy, knew the nature of your oppression, knew that your suffering was physical, and that your spirit, if you could protect it, might remain intact. But at the Ashworth estate the suffering was invisible. The oppression was psychological, and the system was designed not just to control your body, but to break your spirit, to destroy your sense of self, to turn you into a smiling automaton who appeared happy while dying inside. I arrived on a Tuesday morning in April, chained in a wagon with 3 other slaves who'd been purchased at auction in Charleston. The overseer who met us at the gate was a thin man named Samuel Morrison, and his first words set the tone for everything that would follow. "Welcome to the Ashworth estate," he said, his voice pleasant, almost friendly. "You're going to find that things are different here. Better. Mistress Ashworth believes in treating her property with kindness and respect. You'll be well-fed, adequately housed, and you'll never be whipped or beaten. All we ask in return is one simple thing. You must smile always. No matter what you're feeling, no matter what's happening, you must maintain a pleasant, cheerful expression. That's the only rule that matters here. Smile and you'll be fine. Fail to smile and well, you'll learn about the consequences if it comes to that." The other slaves in the wagon looked confused, uncertain whether this was some kind of joke or test, but I understood immediately. I'd heard rumors about the Ashworth estate, whispers in the slave quarters of my previous plantation, about the happy slaves of North Carolina, about the place where everyone smiled and no one was whipped, but where something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. "What if we don't feel like smiling?" I asked, my voice flat, challenging. "What if we're sad or angry or just tired? Are we supposed to pretend to be happy when we're not?" Morrison's own smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. You're not pretending to be happy, he said. You're choosing to be grateful for the kindness Mistress Ashworth shows you. You're choosing to express appreciation for the fact that you're treated better here than on any other plantation in the South. And yes, you're expected to smile always. It's not a difficult requirement really, just a small gesture of respect and gratitude. And if we refuse, I pressed, then you'll spend time in reflection cabin, Morrison said, his voice still pleasant, but with an undertone that made my skin crawl. It's a place where slaves who struggle with the smiling requirement can reconsider their attitude. Most people only need to visit once. After that, they smile quite naturally. We were taken to the slave quarters, clean, well-maintained cabins that were shockingly comfortable compared to what I'd known before. We were given adequate clothing, shown where to get food, introduced to the other slaves who would be our neighbors and co-workers, and every single one of them was smiling. Constantly unnaturally, their faces frozen in expressions of cheerfulness that looked increasingly grotesque the longer I observed them. Welcome, a woman named Sarah said to me, her smile wide and fixed, her eyes empty. You're going to love it here. Mistress Ashworth is so kind. We're so lucky to be here. So blessed, so happy. Her words were right, but her tone was wrong, flat, mechanical, like she was reciting lines she'd memorized rather than expressing genuine feelings. And when I looked into her eyes, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Absolute bottomless terror hidden behind that forced smile. What happened to you? I asked quietly when we were briefly alone. What is this place really? Sarah's smile never wavered, but tears began streaming down her face, a grotesque contrast that made her look like a broken doll. Smile, she whispered, just smile, Abel. Don't ask questions, don't resist, don't ever stop smiling, because if you do, if you're sent to the reflection cabin, you'll come back changed, you'll come back broken, and you'll smile for the rest of your life because you'll be too terrified to do anything else. What happens in the reflection cabin? I asked, but Sarah just shook her head, her smile fixed, her tears still falling. I can't talk about it. None of us can. We're not allowed. Just please, Abel, for your own sake, smile, always smile. That evening I was summoned to the big house to meet Mistress Ashworth. She was a woman in her 40s, elegant and refined, with the bearing of someone who'd been educated and cultured, who'd traveled and experienced the world beyond the plantation. She'd been an actress before marrying Master Ashworth. I would learn later. Had performed on stages in Charleston and Savannah. Had been celebrated for her ability to portray emotion, to manipulate audiences, to make people feel exactly what she wanted them to feel. And she'd brought those skills to plantation management, had created a system of control that was far more sophisticated and far more devastating than anything I'd encountered before. Abel, she said, her voice warm and welcoming. I'm so pleased to have you here. I've heard you had a difficult time on your previous plantation. Brutal treatment, excessive punishment, inadequate care. That won't happen here. I believe in treating my slaves, mainly in recognizing your humanity, even within the constraints of your legal status. All I ask is that you show gratitude for that treatment. All I ask is that you smile, and if I don't, I asked, unable to keep the challenge out of my voice. Mistress Ashworth's own smile never wavered, but something flickered in her eyes, something cold and calculating and deeply disturbing. Then you'll visit the reflection cabin, she said pleasantly. It's a place for contemplation, for reconsidering one's attitude, for understanding the many blessings one has been given. Most people find it very enlightening. They emerge with a much better appreciation for the kindness they've been shown. What happens in the reflection cabin? I asked. You find out if you choose not to smile, Mistress Ashworth said, but I hope it won't come to that. I hope you'll be smart enough, grateful enough to simply accept the one small requirement I have. Smile, Abel. It's such a simple thing, such a small price to pay for the comfort and security you'll enjoy here. I looked at her perfect smile, at her cultured manner, at the way she spoke about slavery as if it were a gift she was bestowing rather than a system of oppression she was perpetuating, and I made a decision that would change everything, that would expose the truth about the Ashworth estate, that would ultimately destroy the false utopia she'd created. I refused to smile. No. I said simply, I won't smile. I won't pretend to be happy about being enslaved. I won't play along with this sick game you've created. Do whatever you're going to do to me, but I won't smile. Mistress Ashworth's expression didn't change, but I saw satisfaction in her eyes, saw that she'd been expecting this, perhaps even hoping for it. Very well, she said. You'll go to the reflection cabin tomorrow morning. 1 week should be sufficient, and when you return, Abel, you'll smile. I promise you that. Everyone smiles eventually. That night, I lay in my cabin listening to the sounds of the plantation, settling into sleep, thinking about what was coming, about what happened in the reflection cabin that broke people so completely that they emerged smiling and broken, and unable to speak about their experience. And I wondered if I would be strong enough to resist, if I would emerge with my spirit intact, or if I would become like Sarah and the others, smiling automatons, broken inside, too terrified to do anything but maintain the false happiness that Mistress Ashworth demanded. The Ashworth estate was the only plantation where slaves smiled, but those smiles hid a horror that was worse than any whipping, any chain, any physical brutality I'd ever experienced, and I was about to discover exactly what that horror was. The reflection cabin stood at the edge of the plantation, isolated from the other buildings, surrounded by trees that blocked it from view. It was small, maybe 10 FT by 10 FT, with a single door, no windows, and walls that had been reinforced to block sound. From the outside, it looked innocuous, almost peaceful, like a meditation retreat rather than a place of punishment. But the slaves who'd been inside knew better. They knew that the reflection cabin was where Mistress Ashworth broke people, where she destroyed spirits, where she turned defiant slaves into smiling automatons who would never resist again. They came for me at dawn, 2 overseers who escorted me to the cabin with an almost apologetic manner, like they were sorry for what was about to happen, but powerless to prevent it. Just smile when you come out, one of them said quietly. That's all she wants. Just smile and you'll never have to go back. They opened the door and pushed me inside. The cabin was empty except for a single chair in the center of the room and a small table against one wall. The door closed behind me and I heard the lock click, heard the overseer's footsteps retreating, heard the silence settle around me like a suffocating blanket. I waited, expecting torture, expecting pain, expecting something physical and immediate, but nothing happened. Hours passed, and I was alone in the cabin, sitting in the chair, staring at the walls, wondering when the punishment would begin. It wasn't until evening that I understood the punishment had already begun. The punishment was the waiting, the isolation, the uncertainty about what was coming, and then Mistress Ashworth arrived. I heard her footsteps approaching, heard the lock turning, saw the door open to reveal her silhouette against the fading light. She entered the cabin carrying a lamp, closed the door behind her, and sat down on the chair across from me. "Good evening, Abel," she said, her voice pleasant, conversational. "I hope you've had time to think about your situation, about the choice you've made, about the consequences of refusing to smile." "I'm not going to smile," I said. "No matter what you do to me, we'll see." Mistress Ashworth said, "But first, let me explain something to you. I don't believe in physical punishment. I find it crude, ineffective, and ultimately counterproductive. Whipping a slave might make them obedient through fear, but it doesn't change their spirit, doesn't make them genuinely accept their situation, and that's what I want, Abel. I want genuine acceptance. I want you to understand that smiling isn't just a requirement. It's a privilege, an expression of gratitude for the kindness I show you. You call slavery kindness, I asked. I call humane treatment kindness. Mistress Ashworth corrected. I could work you to death in the fields. I could starve you, beat you, sell your family away, but I don't. I provide adequate food, decent housing, reasonable working conditions. And all I ask in return is that you smile, that you show appreciation for what you've been given. That really so unreasonable. Yeah, I said, because you're asking me to pretend to be happy about being enslaved. You're asking me to lie with my face, to perform happiness I don't feel, to participate in my own oppression by acting like it's a gift. Interesting perspective, Mistress Ashworth said. But let me offer you another one. Let me tell you about your family, Abel. You have a sister, don't you, named Ruth. She's enslaved on a plantation in Georgia. And you have a nephew, a boy named Thomas, about 8 years old. Sweet child. I've made inquiries about them, learned where they are, learned about their circumstances. My blood ran cold. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the fact that I have connections, Abel. I have relationships with plantation owners throughout the South, and if I wanted to, if I felt it was necessary, I could arrange for your sister and nephew to be sold to the worst plantation in the deep South. I could ensure that Ruth ends up in the cane fields of Louisiana, where slaves work until they die, where the mortality rate is so high that owners expect to replace their entire workforce every 7 years. I could ensure that young Thomas is sold to a master who specializes in breaking children, who uses methods so brutal that most don't survive to adulthood. You're lying, Eunice said, but my voice shook. I'm not lying, Mistress Ashworth said calmly. I am explaining the consequences of your choices. You see, Abel, I don't need to hurt you physically. I don't need to whip you or starve you or torture you. All I need to do is make you understand what will happen to the people you love if you don't cooperate. All I need to do is help you imagine in vivid detail the suffering that your sister and nephew will endure if you refuse to smile, and then she began to describe it in graphic, horrifying detail. She painted a picture of what would happen to Ruth and Thomas if I didn't comply. She described the cane fields, the brutal overseers, the diseases and injuries and deaths that were commonplace. She described specific tortures, specific punishments, specific ways that slaves were broken and destroyed. She spoke for hours, her voice never rising, never showing emotion, just calmly and methodically describing horrors that made my stomach turn, that made me want to scream, that made me understand exactly what kind of torture this was. It wasn't physical, it was psychological. She was using my love for my family as a weapon against me, was forcing me to imagine their suffering was making me responsible for their fate. Stop. I finally said, my voice breaking, please stop. I'll stop when you agree to smile, Mistress Ashworth said. I'll stop when you understand that cooperation is the only way to protect the people you love. I'll stop when you accept that smiling is a small price to pay for ensuring that Ruth and Thomas remain safe, that they're not sold to the horrors I've described. This is evil, I said. This is worse than any whipping, any physical torture. You're using my family to break me. I'm using reality to educate you, Mistress Ashworth corrected. Everything I've described is real, Abel. Those plantations exist. Music, those tortures happen. Those deaths occur. I'm not inventing horrors. I'm simply explaining what will happen if you force me to take action. The choice is yours. Smile, and your family remains safe. Refuse, and I'll make one letter, one transaction, and Ruth and Thomas will be sold into the hell I've described. She left, then locked the door behind her, left me alone in the darkness with the images she'd planted in my mind, with the terrible knowledge that she had the power to do exactly what she'd threatened, that my defiance could cost my family everything. And she returned the next night, and the next, and the next. Each time she added more details, more specific descriptions, more vivid images of suffering. She deprived me of adequate food and sleep, kept me in a state of exhaustion and hunger that made me more vulnerable to her psychological manipulation. By the fourth day I was breaking. By the fifth day I was begging her to stop. By the sixth day I understood why everyone who came out of the reflection cabin was changed, was broken, was unable to speak about what had happened, because the torture wasn't something that had been done to your body. It was something that had been done to your mind, to your spirit, to your understanding of what you were capable of enduring. It was the knowledge that someone could use your love as a weapon, could turn your deepest connections into instruments of control, could make you responsible for the suffering of people you cared about. On the seventh day, Mistress Ashworth made her final visit. "It's time to leave the reflection cabin, Abel," she said. "It's time to return to the plantation, to resume your work, to join the community of slaves who understand the rules and follow them. But before you go, I need to know, will you smile? Will you show the gratitude and cooperation I require? Or do I need to write that letter, make that transaction, send Ruth and Thomas to the hell I've described?" I looked at her calm expression, at her certainty that she'd broken me, that she'd won, and I made a decision. Not the decision she expected, not the decision that would have been smart or safe, but the decision that felt necessary, that felt like the only way to preserve some fragment of my humanity. "I'll smile," I said. "I'll do what you want, but I want you to know something, Mistress Ashworth. I want you to understand what you've done, what this place really is, what your humane treatment actually means." "And what is that?" she asked, her tone indulgent, like she was humoring a child. "It means you're worse than any brutal master I've ever known," I said, because at least they were honest about their cruelty. At least they didn't pretend that torture was kindness, that breaking people's spirits was humane treatment. You've created a system that's more evil than any whipping post, any chain, any physical brutality. You've turned love into a weapon, family into a tool of control, and you've made us complicit in our own oppression by forcing us to smile while you destroy us from the inside. Mistress Ashworth's smile never wavered. "Perhaps," she said, "but you'll still smile, won't you, Abel? You'll still follow the rules, still maintain the appearance of happiness, still participate in the system you claim to despise because the alternative, the suffering of your sister and nephew, is too terrible to contemplate?" "Yes," I said, the word tasting like poison. "I'll smile," and I did. When I emerged from the reflection cabin, when I returned to the plantation, when I resumed my work and my life, I smiled. I smiled like all the others, with that fixed, unnatural expression that never reached my eyes, that looked more like a mask than genuine happiness. But my smile was different from the others. My smile carried something that Mistress Ashworth hadn't anticipated, hadn't planned for, hadn't understood was possible. My smile carried rage, pure, concentrated, burning rage that I hid behind the expression she'd forced on me, that I nurtured and protected and planned to use when the opportunity arose, because I'd learned something in the reflection cabin, something that Mistress Ashworth hadn't intended to teach me. I'd learned that her power was based on secrecy, on the fact that no one outside the plantation understood what really happened here, on the illusion that the Ashworth estate was a humane alternative to traditional plantation brutality. And I'd learned that if that secrecy was broken, if the truth about the reflection cabin was exposed, if people understood what humane treatment really meant at the Ashworth estate, then Mistress Ashworth's carefully constructed system would collapse. I just needed to wait for the right moment, the right audience, the right opportunity to speak the truth that everyone on the plantation knew, but was too terrified to say. The smile I wore was a lie, but it was a lie that hid a truth that would eventually destroy everything Mistress Ashworth had built. I'd been on the Ashworth estate for 3 months when I finally understood the full scope of what Mistress Ashworth had created. 3 months of smiling, of working, of observing the other slaves and seeing how completely she'd broken them, how thoroughly she'd destroyed their spirits while leaving their bodies intact. There were about 60 slaves on the plantation, and every single one of them smiled constantly. But if you watched closely, if you paid attention to the details, you could see the variations in their smiles, could read the different kinds of brokenness that each one represented. Some, like Sarah, cried while they smiled, tears streaming down their faces while their mouths remained fixed in expressions of cheerfulness. Others, like an old man named Moses, had smiles that looked more like grimaces, like their facial muscles had been trained to hold the expression, even though everything inside them was screaming. Still others, like a young woman named Rebecca, had smiles that were completely blank, empty, like they'd retreated so far inside themselves that the smile was just a mask worn by a body that no longer contained a person. And then there was me. My smile was different because it was deliberate, conscious, maintained not through broken spirit, but through calculated choice. I smiled because I decided to play along, to wait for the right moment, to preserve my strength and my sanity for the confrontation I knew was coming. But maintaining that smile, keeping up the pretense, was exhausting in ways I hadn't anticipated. Every moment of every day I had to monitor my expression, had to ensure that I was smiling, had to suppress every genuine emotion that might show on my face. Anger, sadness, frustration, fear, all of it had to be hidden behind that fixed smile, had to be buried so deep that no one could see it, and the psychological toll was enormous. I began to understand why the other slaves were so broken, why they couldn't speak about what had happened in the reflection cabin, why they'd been so thoroughly destroyed by Mistress Ashworth's methods. Because living with constant fear for your family, with the knowledge that your defiance could cost them everything, with the burden of maintaining a false expression every moment of every day, it wore you down, eroded your sense of self, made you question whether you were even a person anymore, or just a performing animal trained to display the right emotions on command. But I had something the others didn't have, a plan, a purpose, a reason to endure beyond simple survival. I was going to expose Mistress Ashworth. I was going to reveal the truth about the reflection cabin. I was going to destroy the false utopia she'd created and show the world what humane treatment really meant at the Ashworth estate. I just needed the right opportunity. That opportunity came in late July, when Mistress Ashworth announced that she would be hosting a grand party at the estate, a celebration to showcase her plantation to influential visitors from across the South. Plantation owners, politicians, journalists, abolitionists, and anti-abolitionists would all be there, all eager to see the famous Ashworth estate, to witness the happy slaves that everyone had heard about. This is our chance to show the world what enlightened plantation management looks like. Mistress Ashworth told us during a gathering in the yard. This is our opportunity to demonstrate that slavery, when practiced humanely, can be a benevolent institution. I expect all of you to be on your best behavior, to smile and be cheerful, to show our guests how well you're treated here. This is important, and I'm counting on all of you to make me proud. As she spoke, I saw my opportunity. A room full of influential people, all watching, all observing, all forming opinions about slavery based on what they saw at the Ashworth estate. If I could speak the truth in that moment, if I could expose what really happened here, if I could break the silence that protected Mistress Ashworth's system, then maybe, just maybe, I could destroy everything she'd built. But it was risky, incredibly risky. If I spoke out, if I broke the rules, if I stopped smiling and told the truth, Mistress Ashworth would follow through on her threats. She would sell Ruth and Thomas to the worst plantation she could find. She would destroy my family to punish me for my defiance, unless I could make the exposure so public, so damaging, so impossible to ignore that she wouldn't dare retaliate, unless I could create a scandal so enormous that any action she took against my family would only make things worse for her. It was a gamble, a terrible gamble with my family's lives as the stakes, but it was also the only chance I would ever have to strike back, to resist, to do something more than just smile and endure. I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I rehearsed what I would say, how I would say it, how I would make the truth undeniable and impossible to dismiss. I observed Mistress Ashworth, learned her patterns, identified the moment during the party when she would be most vulnerable, when the maximum number of influential people would be watching, and I made peace with the consequences. I accepted that speaking out would probably cost me my life, that Mistress Ashworth would have me killed or sold to the worst plantation in the south. I accepted that my family might suffer, that Ruth and Thomas might pay the price for my defiance. But I also understood that some things were worth dying for, that some truths needed to be spoken regardless of the cost, that silence in the face of evil was its own kind of death. The party took place on a Saturday evening in early August. The big house was filled with guests, maybe 50 people, all dressed in their finest clothes, all eager to see the famous Ashworth estate and its happy slaves. We served food and drinks, smiled and bowed, played our roles perfectly, gave them exactly what they expected to see. And Mistress Ashworth was in her element, playing the gracious hostess, explaining her philosophy of plantation management, basking in the admiration of her guests. "You see," she said to a group gathered in the parlor, "the key to successful slavery is treating your property with kindness and respect. My slaves are well-fed, adequately housed, never subjected to physical punishment, and in return they are grateful, cooperative, genuinely happy. Just look at their faces. They're smiling because they understand how fortunate they are. It's remarkable," one of the guests said, a journalist from Charleston. "I've never seen slaves who appeared so content." "You've created something truly special here, Mistress Ashworth." "Thank you, Mr. Ashworth," said her own smile radiant. "I believe this is the future of slavery in the South. Humane treatment, mutual respect, recognition of our slaves' humanity within the constraints of their legal status. This is how all plantations should operate." I was standing in the corner holding a tray of drinks, smiling my fixed smile, waiting for the right moment. And then Mistress Ashworth made a mistake. She called attention to me specifically, used me as an example, put me in the spotlight in front of all those influential guests. "Abel," she said, gesturing toward me, "come here. I want our guests to meet you." Abel is one of our newer acquisitions transferred from a brutal plantation in South Carolina. Tell our guests, Abel, how does the Ashworth estate compare to your previous situation? Are you happier here? This was it. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Every eye in the room was on me. Every influential person was watching, waiting to hear me confirm Mistress Ashworth's narrative to validate her claims about humane treatment. I walked forward, still smiling, still playing my role, and then slowly, deliberately, I let the smile fade from my face. I let my expression become neutral, then serious, then filled with the rage and pain and truth that I'd been hiding for 3 months. The room went silent. Everyone stared at me, shocked by the transformation, by the sudden absence of the smile that was supposed to be constant. that was supposed to be proof of the Ashworth estate's benevolence. "No," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I'm not happier here. I'm more broken here, because Mistress Ashworth has created something worse than any brutal plantation I've ever known. She's created a system of psychological torture disguised as kindness, a method of control that destroys spirits while leaving bodies intact. Abel," Mistress Ashworth began, her voice sharp with warning, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. This was my one chance, my only opportunity to speak the truth, and I was going to take it regardless of the consequences. "You want to know why we smile?" I continued, addressing the guests, making sure every word was heard. "We smile because we're terrified. We smile because Mistress Ashworth has threatened our families, has promised to sell them to the worst plantations in the South if we don't maintain constant expressions of happiness. We smile because she's broken us in ways that whips and chains never could." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Mistress Ashworth's face went pale, then red, then pale again. "He's lying," she said quickly. "He's a troublemaker, a malcontent. Don't listen to him." "Am I lying?" I asked, turning to face her directly. "Then let me describe what happens in the reflection cabin. Let me tell these good people about your methods, about how you break slaves without ever touching them physically." And I did. I described everything. The isolation, the sleep deprivation, the graphic descriptions of torture that would befall our families if we didn't cooperate. The psychological manipulation that destroyed spirits while leaving bodies unmarked. I described how she used our love as a weapon, how she turned family connections into tools of control, how she forced us to smile while destroying us from the inside. I spoke for 10 minutes, maybe longer, and no one interrupted me. The guests listened in horrified silence, their expressions shifting from shock to disgust to dawning understanding. And Mistress Ashworth stood frozen, unable to stop me, unable to deny what I was saying, because every word was true, and everyone in the room could see it in my face, could hear it in my voice, could recognize the authenticity of trauma that couldn't be faked. When I finished, when I'd said everything I needed to say, the room remained silent for a long moment. Then the journalist from Charleston spoke. "Is this true, Mistress Ashworth? Are you using psychological torture to control your slaves? Are you threatening their families to force compliance?" I provide humane treatment," Mistress Ashworth stammered, her composure finally cracking. "I don't whip them. I don't beat them. I just require them to show gratitude, to smile, to appreciate what they've been given, by threatening to destroy their families if they don't." Another guest asked, his voice filled with disgust. "By breaking their spirits through psychological manipulation. That's not humane treatment, Mistress Ashworth. That's something far worse." The party dissolved into chaos, guests left in disgust. Journalists took notes for articles that would expose the truth about the Ashworth estate. Abolitionists found new ammunition for their arguments against slavery, and Mistress Ashworth's reputation, her carefully constructed image as an enlightened plantation owner, was destroyed in a single evening. As for me, I was dragged away by overseers, beaten for the first time since arriving at the plantation, locked in a storage room to await my fate. I knew what was coming. I would be sold probably to the worst plantation Mistress Ashworth could find. Probably to a place where I would die within months from brutal treatment. But I'd accomplished what I'd set out to do. I'd exposed the truth. I'd destroyed the false utopia. I'd shown the world that the Ashworth estate's happy slaves were actually broken people forced to smile while suffering psychological torture, and I'd done it in front of witnesses who couldn't be silenced, who would spread the story, who would ensure that Mistress Ashworth's methods were exposed and condemned. The smile I'd worn for 3 months was finally gone, and I would never Smile for a master again. The beating I received after exposing Mistress Ashworth was brutal, but brief. The overseers seemed almost reluctant to inflict it, as if they understood that the entire system they'd been part of was collapsing around them. They locked me in a storage room, gave me water, but no food, and left me alone to contemplate my fate. I knew what was coming. Mistress Ashworth would sell me to the worst plantation she could find, would ensure that I suffered for my defiance, would make an example of me to any other slaves who might consider speaking out, and she would follow through on her threats against Ruth and Thomas, would sell them to brutal plantations as punishment for my actions. But I also knew that the exposure had worked, that the scandal was spreading, that journalists were writing articles about the psychological torture at the Ashworth estate, that abolitionists were using my testimony as evidence of slavery's inherent evil, regardless of how humanely it was practiced. The false utopia was destroyed, and that was worth whatever price I would pay. On the third day of my confinement, Mistress Ashworth came to see me. She looked different. Older, tired, her usual composure replaced by barely controlled rage and something that might have been fear. "You've destroyed everything," she said, her voice shaking. "Everything I built, everything I created, everything I worked for. You destroyed it all with your lies and your theatrics." "They weren't lies," I said. "Every word I spoke was true. You know it was true. Everyone who heard me knows it was true. It doesn't matter." Mistress Ashworth said, "Truth or lies, you've ruined me. The newspapers are calling me a monster. My neighbors are shunning me. Visitors who came to admire my plantation are now spreading stories about psychological torture and broken slaves. You've made me infamous, Abel. Music, you've turned me into exactly what I was trying not to be. You were always a monster." I said, "You just hid it better than most. You dressed up your cruelty in the language of kindness, disguised your torture as humane treatment, but it was always evil, Mistress Ashworth. It was always wrong, and now everyone knows it, and now you'll pay for it." Mistress Ashworth said, "I'm selling you to a plantation in Louisiana. The owner specializes in breaking troublesome slaves. You'll work in the cane fields until you die, which probably won't take long, and your sister Ruth and your nephew Thomas. I'm making arrangements to have them sold as well to the worst plantations I can find. You wanted to be a hero, Abel. You wanted to expose the truth. Well, congratulations. Your heroism is going to cost your family everything." I'd known this was coming, had accepted it as the price of speaking out, but hearing it confirmed, hearing her describe the fate that awaited Ruth and Thomas, still felt like a knife in my chest. "Do what you want to me," I said, "but leave my family alone. They had nothing to do with this. Punish me, not them." "Oh, I'm punishing you," Mistress Ashworth said, "by punishing them, by making you live with the knowledge that your defiance destroyed the people you love. That's a far more effective punishment than anything I could do to your body." She left then, and I was alone with the knowledge of what I'd done, with the terrible weight of consequences that extended beyond just me, with the understanding that my act of resistance had cost my family their safety. But 2 days later, something unexpected happened. Jonathan Webb, the abolitionist who'd helped Joseph escape years earlier, who'd been at the party and had witnessed my testimony, came to visit me. "I've been making inquiries," Webb told me quietly, speaking through the locked door of my confinement, "about your sister Ruth and your nephew Thomas, and I have good news and bad news." "What's the good news?" I asked. "The good news is that Mistress Ashworth was lying to you," Webb said. "Ruth and Thomas don't exist, or rather, they exist, but not in the way she described. I've traced the records, talked to people who knew you on your previous plantation. You have a sister named Ruth, but she died 10 years ago, and you never had a nephew named Thomas. Mistress Ashworth invented them, or at least invented the threat to them as a way to control you." I stared at him, unable to process what he was saying. She was lying the whole time in the reflection cabin. All those threats, all those descriptions of what would happen to them, it was all lies. Yes, Webb confirmed. That's her method. She researches her slaves, learns about their families, and then uses that information to create threats that seem real but are actually fabricated. Some of the threats are real. She does have connections, can arrange sales and transfers, but most of what she describes is psychological manipulation designed to break you through fear rather than through actual consequences. But I saw her records. I said she had information about Ruth, about where she was enslaved, about Thomas. Information she invented or distorted. Webb said she's very good at creating convincing lies, at making threats seem real when they're actually empty. That's how she controls people, not through actual power over their families, but through the fear of that power, through making slaves believe she can destroy their loved ones, when in reality she often can't or won't. The revelation was staggering. I'd endured 3 months of psychological torture, had maintained that false smile, had lived in constant fear. My family, all based on lies, all based on threats that Mistress Ashworth had no intention or ability to carry out. Why didn't anyone tell me? I asked. Why didn't the other slaves warn me that her threats were often empty? Because they don't know, Webb said. That's the genius of her system. Each slave believes their own situation is unique, that the threats against their specific family members are real, even if others might not be. And they're too terrified to compare notes, too isolated by fear to realize that they're all being manipulated in similar ways. Mistress Ashworth has created a system where everyone is controlled by individualized threats that seem real, but are often fabricated. So Ruth and Thomas are safe. I asked, still trying to understand. Mistress Ashworth can't hurt them because they don't exist in the way she described. Exactly. Webb confirmed. Your sister Ruth is dead, has been for years. There is no nephew Thomas. The threats were empty. You were tortured psychologically based on lies. Anger that flooded through me was unlike anything I'd ever felt. I'd been broken, manipulated, controlled based on fabricated threats, based on fears that Mistress Ashworth had deliberately cultivated. She'd used my love for family members who were dead or non-existent to destroy my spirit, force me to smile, to turn me into one of her broken automatons. There's more, Webb said. The scandal you created, it's bigger than you know. Newspapers across the South are writing about the Ashworth estate, about psychological torture, disguised as humane treatment. Abolitionists are using your testimony as evidence that slavery is evil regardless of how it's practiced. And several of Mistress Ashworth's neighbors are now investigating their own plantations, worried that they might be using similar methods without realizing it. What about Mistress Ashworth? I asked. What's going to happen to her? She's ruined, Webb said. Socially, financially, reputationally. No one wants to associate with her anymore. Her plantation is failing because slaves are refusing to smile, are openly defying her now that the truth is exposed. She's trying to sell the estate, but no one wants to buy it. It's become infamous, a symbol of slavery's psychological cruelty. And me, I asked, what's going to happen to me? That's why I'm here, Webb said. I'm buying you. I've made arrangements with Mistress Ashworth. She's desperate for money, willing to sell you to me rather than to the Louisiana plantation. She threatened, and once the sale is complete, I'm going to free you. You'll be a free man, able, free to go wherever you want to build whatever life you choose. I couldn't speak. The reversal was too sudden, too complete. I'd expected to die in Louisiana, had accepted that fate as the price of speaking truth, and now I was being told that I would be free, that the threats against my family had been empty, that my act of defiance had destroyed Mistress Ashworth's system without costing me everything. Why? I finally asked, why are you doing this? Because you're a hero, Webb said simply, because you spoke truth when everyone else was silent, because you exposed a system of evil that was hiding behind the language of kindness, because you deserve freedom, Abel. You've earned it. The sale was completed a week later. Jonathan Webb purchased me for a fraction of what I should have been worth. Mistress Ashworth was desperate, willing to accept any offer just to be rid of me, to remove the reminder of her exposed cruelty, And true to his word, Webb freed me immediately. He gave me mission papers, gave me money to start a new life, gave me contacts in the North who could help me find work and build a future. What will you do? Webb asked as we prepared to leave the Ashworth estate for the last time. I don't know yet. I said honestly, but I know what I won't do. I won't smile unless I mean it. I won't pretend to be happy when I'm not. I won't ever again let someone use my emotions as a weapon against me. As we rode away from the plantation, I looked back one final time. The Ashworth estate, the only plantation where slaves smiled, was falling apart. The slaves had stopped smiling, had begun openly defying Mistress Ashworth, had started demanding real humane treatment rather than the psychological torture she'd disguised as kindness. The false utopia was destroyed, and I had destroyed it not through violence or escape, but through truth, through speaking out, through refusing to smile when smiling meant participating in my own oppression. I spent the next year in Philadelphia working with Jonathan Webb and other abolitionists, telling my story to anyone who would listen. My testimony about the Ashworth estate became famous in anti-slavery circles, was published in abolitionist newspapers, was used as evidence in debates about whether humane slavery was possible or whether the institution was inherently evil regardless of how it was practiced. Your story proves what we've been saying all along. Frederick Douglass told me when we met at an abolitionist convention that slavery is evil not just because of physical brutality, but because of what it does to the human spirit, that you can't own another person humanely because ownership itself is dehumanizing, that psychological torture is just as devastating as physical torture, perhaps more so because it leaves no visible scars. I just told the truth. I said, I just described what happened to me, what I witnessed, what the Ashworth estate really was beneath its facade of kindness, and that truth has changed minds. Douglass said, people who might have been sympathetic to humane slavery, who might have thought that the institution could be reformed rather than abolished, are now understanding that there's no such thing as benevolent bondage. You've done important work, Abel. You've helped advance the cause of freedom. But I also learned what had happened to the other slaves at the Ashworth estate, and that knowledge was more complicated, more troubling than I'd expected. After my exposure, after the scandal broke, Mistress Ashworth's system collapsed completely. The slaves stopped smiling, started openly defying her, demanded real changes in their treatment, and Mistress Ashworth, desperate and financially ruined, began selling them off to other plantations, some to relatively decent owners, others to brutal ones, scattering the community that had been held together by shared trauma and forced smiles. Sarah, the woman who'd warned me on my first day, was sold to a plantation in Virginia where conditions were harsh, but not as psychologically devastating as the Ashworth estate. She wrote to me once through an intermediary, telling me that she was grateful for what I'd done, that she'd rather endure physical hardship than the psychological torture of forced smiling. I can be sad now, she wrote, I can be angry. I can feel what I actually feel rather than pretending to be happy all the time. That's worth everything, Abel. You gave us back our emotions, our ability to be genuine, our humanity. Thank you, but others weren't so fortunate. Moses, the old man with a grimacing smile, died within months of being sold to a new plantation. His body weakened by years of psychological stress, unable to adapt to new circumstances. Rebecca, the young woman with the blank smile, was sold to a plantation in Mississippi and disappeared from all records. No one knew what happened to her, whether she survived or died, whether she ever recovered from the trauma of the Ashworth estate. And Mistress Ashworth herself suffered a fate that was both just and tragic. Unable to sell her plantation, shunned by her neighbors, financially ruined and socially destroyed, she retreated into isolation. She died in 1858, 3 years after my exposure, alone in her big house, her reputation destroyed, her legacy one of psychological cruelty rather than the enlightened plantation management she'd tried to create. "Do you feel guilty?" Webb asked me once as we discussed the aftermath of my testimony about what happened to the other slaves, about how your exposure led to them being scattered and sold. Yes, I admitted I feel guilty that my act of defiance had consequences for people beyond just me. But I also believe it was necessary. The Ashworth estate was evil, Webb. It was a system of torture disguised as kindness. It needed to be exposed. Music needed to be destroyed, even if that destruction caused short-term suffering for the people trapped in it. That's the dilemma of resistance. Webb said, sometimes fighting back causes immediate harm to the people you're trying to help. Sometimes exposing evil creates chaos that's painful for everyone involved, but that doesn't mean resistance is wrong. It just means that the path to justice is complicated, that there are no clean solutions, that sometimes you have to accept difficult consequences in pursuit of necessary change. I carried that understanding with me as I built my new life in freedom. I worked as a speaker, traveling to churches and meeting halls, telling my story, helping people understand the psychological dimensions of slavery's evil. I wrote articles for abolitionist newspapers describing the Ashworth estate in detail, explaining how psychological torture could be just as devastating as physical brutality, and I never smiled unless I meant it, never forced an expression I didn't feel, never pretended to be happy when I wasn't, because I'd learned that forced smiles were a form of oppression, that being required to display emotions you didn't feel was a way of denying your humanity, that genuine expression, even of negative emotions, was a form of freedom. The Civil War came in 1861, and I joined the Union Army, fought for the abolition of slavery, used my freedom to help win freedom for others, and when the war ended, when slavery was finally abolished, I thought about the Ashworth estate, about the slaves who'd been forced to smile, about Mistress Ashworth's attempt to create a humane version of an inherently inhumane institution, and I understood that my exposure, my testimony, my refusal to smile had been part of a larger story, the story of how slavery was finally recognized as evil in all its forms, how the myth of benevolent bondage was destroyed, how people came to understand that you couldn't own another person kindly, that ownership itself was the problem regardless of how it was practiced. I lived until 1889, dying at the age of 64, having spent 34 years in freedom, longer than I'd spent in slavery, and in those years of freedom I'd built a life. Raised a family, I married a woman named Grace, had 3 children who grew up free, contributed to the cause of justice and equality, but I never forgot the Ashworth estate, never forgot the slaves who'd been forced to smile, never forgot Mistress Ashworth's psychological torture disguised as humane treatment, never forgot the reflection cabin and what happened there, the lies and manipulation that broke spirits while leaving bodies intact. And I never forgot that sometimes the most important act of resistance is refusing to pretend, refusing to smile when smiling means participating in your own oppression, refusing to display emotions you don't feel just because someone with power demands it. The Ashworth estate was the only plantation where slaves smiled, but those smiles were lies, masks hiding trauma, performances forced by psychological torture, and I'd exposed those lies. I'd torn off the masks, I'd shown the world what those forced smiles really meant, and in doing so, I'd helped destroy not just one plantation's false utopia, but the entire myth that slavery could ever be practiced humanely, that bondage could ever be benevolent, that you could own another person Without destroying their humanity, the broken smile I'd worn for 3 months became a symbol, a reminder that forced happiness is a form of oppression, that genuine emotion is a form of freedom, that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to pretend that everything is fine when it isn't. This was the story of Abel, a slave who in 1855 was transferred to the Ashworth estate in North Carolina, a plantation famous for its humane treatment, where slaves were well-fed, adequately housed, and never physically punished, but where they were required to smile constantly. Abel discovered that the plantation's benevolence was a facade, hiding a system of psychological torture. Slaves who refused to smile were sent to the reflection cabin where Mistress Ashworth, a former actress, used sleep deprivation and detailed threats against their families to break their spirit. Without leaving physical marks, after spending a week in the reflection cabin, Abel emerged with a forced smile, but also with a plan to expose the truth. 3 months later, during a party attended by influential guests, including journalists and abolitionists, Abel stopped smiling and publicly described the psychological torture that occurred at the Ashworth estate, destroying Mistress Ashworth's reputation and exposing the myth of humane slavery. He was subsequently freed by Jonathan Webb, an abolitionist who revealed that many of Mistress Ashworth's threats had been fabricated, lies designed to manipulate slaves through fear. The scandal destroyed the Ashworth estate, scattered its slave population, and contributed to the broader abolitionist argument that slavery was inherently evil regardless of how it was practiced. Abel spent the rest of his life as a free man, working as an abolitionist speaker and writer, helping to advance the cause of freedom, and never again smiling unless he genuinely meant it. He died in 1889, having lived 34 years in freedom, and his testimony about the Ashworth estate became an important part of the historical record documenting slavery. Psychological dimensions. The echoes of Abel's courage reverberate through time, a haunting reminder that oppression takes many forms, that cruelty can hide behind the language of kindness, and that psychological torture can be just as devastating as physical brutality. The Ashworth estate represented something uniquely sinister, a system that recognized slaves' humanity just enough to exploit it more effectively, that used love and family connections as weapons of control that broke spirits while leaving bodies intact, and called it humane treatment. For 3 months, Abel endured the forced smile, the constant performance of happiness, the psychological weight of believing his defiance would destroy his family. But when the moment came, when he had the opportunity to speak truth to power in front of witnesses who couldn't be silenced, he chose resistance over safety, chose exposure over survival, chose to tear off the mask, even knowing the terrible price he might pay. His testimony destroyed not just one plantation's false utopia, but contributed to the broader understanding that slavery could never be practiced humanely, that ownership itself was dehumanizing, regardless of how it was dressed up in the language of benevolence. The forced smiles of the Ashworth estate became a symbol of how oppression operates not just through violence, but through the demand that the oppressed perform happiness, that they participate in their own subjugation by pretending to be grateful for their bondage. If these untold stories of psychological resistance and moral courage resonate with you, join our community. Subscribe to Slave Revenge to uncover more hidden truths from the shadows of slavery. Stories of those who refused to pretend, who spoke truth when silent was safer, who proved that sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to smile when smiling means accepting your own oppression. Your support ensures these powerful narratives of psychological warfare and hard-won freedom continue to challenge and inspire. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts. What does Abel's story teach us about the nature of psychological oppression? How do we recognize and resist demands that we perform emotions we don't feel? What would you have done in his position? Let us know which untold tale you'd like to hear.